33. Ammonites curvatus. Tablet 21, figure 18. Depressed, subumbiculate, volutions deeply inserted, transversely radiated, radii falciform, bifurcate at the commencement, terminating in broad, tubercular, curved costae. Careen with a longitudinal sulcus, between two marginal rows of tubercles, aperture obtusely sagittate. This ammonite is nearly allied to the preceding, but is evidently a distinct species. In A. falcatus, the curvatures are more numerous than the oblique radii, but in the present species, the proportions are reversed, 2 or 3 radii uniting to form one curved rib. The terminations of the ribs in the latter are tubercular, and separated from each other by a sulcus. In the former, they are gently curved, and appear as if folded or plated over each other. The umbiculus is rather deeper than in A. falcatus, and has a marginal row of oblique tubercular projections, from each of which 2 or 3 radii proceed to the center of the volutions. Here they unite and form a broad, curved rib that terminates in an elongated tubercle in the margin of the ambit. Another tubercle is placed on the middle of the curved part. The keel is grooved and has 2 rows of prominent, distinct, opposite tubercles formed by the termination of the ribs. Locality Hamzy. The specimen figured was discovered by my brother and is unique. 34. Ammonites complanatus. Flat, volutions wholly inserted, the inner half marked with numerous indistinct transverse undulating striae, the outer portion plicated. Umbilicus very small, almost concealed. Careen slightly convex. Its margins crenated by the angular terminations of the plicae. Aperture slightly sagittate. Siphunculus. The longest diameter is about 8 inches, greatest thickness 1.8 inch, width of the outer volution 5 inches. The volutions are thickest near the middle and gradually contract into a narrow keel, which at the aperture does not exceed 0.4 inch in width and has an elevation or ridge down the center. The plicae are small and extend from the outer margin over 1/3 of the wreath, but the intermediate ones do not reach beyond half that distance. Their terminations are angular and form a crenated border on each side the keel. This species may be distinguished by its flatness, the great width of the outer volution, the small conical umbilicus, the narrow keel, and the angular plicae. The septa are numerous and very foliaceous. Locality Hamzy. 35. Scaphites striatus. Tablet 22, figures 3, 4, 9, 11, 13, 14, 15, 16. Volutions transversely striated, striae numerous, oblique, annular, bifurcate. Dorsum tumid. Aperture produced, transversely ovate, marginate. Siphunculus internal. This species is commonly about an inch in length. The greatest thickness is 0.4 inch, width 0.8 inch. The inner whorls are umbiculate, deeply inserted and wholly concealed by the outer volutions. The dorsum is suddenly enlarged, and the reflected turn terminates before it reaches the center. The aperture is entire, of an irregular ovate form, the margin prominent, the upper part produced, extending a little over the spire. The whole shell is striated. The striae arise singly from the inner margin, and, dividing into 2 or 3, pass over the dorsum and unite with the corresponding ones of the opposite side. The inner half of the outer volution is somewhat depressed, and from thence the striae extend obliquely in a radiating manner, and bifurcate at the edge of the depression. Towards the aperture of the shell, the striae are larger and more distinct. The septa are but slightly concave, and their edges have 3 principal indentations, with several minute sinuosities. The situation of the Sphinculus is unknown, but appears to have been on the internal margin. The specimens consist of indurated Marlaceous casts, occasionally possessing portions of the shell. The inner volutions are often filled with sulphuret of iron, and sometimes with calcareous spar. In almost every instance, the spire is more or less oblique and otherwise distorted by compression. The variations of shape observable in the specimens delineated have evidently been produced by this cause. Tablet 22, Figure 3, a dorsal, and Figure 4, a lateral view of a scaphite from Hamsey, flattened by compression. Figure 9 exhibits the obliquity of the spire. A straight specimen in my possession proves that this appearance is the effect of accident. Figure 11 exhibits the usual characters of the species. The aperture is broken off. Figure 13, a specimen from Ranscombe, remarkably distorted. Figures 14, 15, different views of a pyritis cast of the inner volution. The dark spot in the center of figure 14 shows the supposed situation of the Sphinculus. Figure 16 is a longitudinal section. The inner chamber is filled with dark brown sulphuret of iron. Localities: Hamsey, Rodmill, Brighton. 36. Scaphites costatus. Tablet 22, Figures 8, 12. Volutions convex, laterally compressed, transversely striated, inner whorls concealed, inserted, striae furcate, numerous, embracing the ambit, sides of the outer volution smooth, with 8 or 10 distant, oblique, nodular projections, dorsum broad, convex. This is a less delicate shell than the former. Its length is 1 inch, width 0.8 inch, thickness of the back 0.6 inch. It is distinguished from S. striatus by the nodular projections on the sides of the external volutions. These proceed from the center and diverge into numerous striae, which encircle the ambit. The back is broad, and the projecting terminations of the striae give its edges an undulated appearance. The aperture is oblong, and fronts the spiral part. Localities: Hamsey, very rare. 37. Hamites armatus. Tablet 23, Figures 3, 4. Tablet 16, Figure 5. Depressed, ornamented with oblique annular costae, and 4 rows of tubercles, the marginal ones spinous, Sphinculus external, limbs straight, parallel, The characters of this beautiful hamite were first developed by a gigantic specimen found in a marl pit at Roche, near Benson, in Oxfordshire, by Professor Buckland, and figured in Mineral Conchology. Previously to this discovery, Figure 4 was the finest example extant. The casts of the shell only remain, and the spinous processes are in consequence but rarely preserved. The form of the original was in all probability cylindrical, but the fossil specimens are in some degree flattened and distorted. The limbs are straight, the hook or bend being very sudden. There are generally 1 or 2 costae between each annular row of tubercles, and the latter embrace 2 or 3 ribs. The spines are only known to proceed from the 2 dorsal rows of tubercles, but it seems probable that the other tubercles are also the rudiments of spinous processes, since all of them are imperfect and appear as if broken off. The septa are very foliaceous. Tablet 16, Figure 5, is a fine fragment from Hamsey. Traces of the foliaceous septa are visible at the fractured part. Tablet 23, Figure 3, view of one of the septa, or chambers, showing its foliaceous structure. Tablet 23, Figure 4. This fine specimen has already been noticed. It is so much distorted by compression that only 2 rows of tubercles are seen in this view. It was discovered at Hamsey by my brother. Localities: Hamsey, Middleham. Rare. Hamites plicatilis. Tablet 23, Figures 1, 2. Subcylindrical with numerous oblique annular ridges and 4 rows of spines. Limbs curved. The curvature of the limbs distinguishes this species from the one above described, with which, however, it closely corresponds in every other particular. Tablet 23, Figure 1, is the only specimen yet discovered in which the spines remain. They are composed of a thin pellicle of reddish-brown sulphurate of iron that has replaced the original shell. This example is part of the lesser limb, broken off near the curvature. It is inverted in the engraving. Tablet 23, Figure 2, part of the larger limb, showing traces of the foliaceous septa. Localities: Hamsey, Middleham. Very rare. Hamites alternatus. Tablet 23, Figures 10, 11. Subcylindrical with oblique annular costae and 2 rows of tubercles, tubercles marginal, placed on each alternate costa. Curvature gradual. I have seen but 1 fragment of this species, which, except in size, agrees with H. spinulosus of Sowerby, the tubercles being in all probability the bases of spines. It is, however, impossible to determine their identity without more perfect examples. The specimen is elliptical from compression. The ribs are very distinct on the sides and back, but almost obliterated on the inner margin. The tubercles are placed on each alternate rib, a circumstance that separates this species from the other spiniferous hamites previously described. Locality: Middleham. Hamites ellipticus. Tablet 23, Figure 9, depressed, surrounded by even, undulating ridges, each ornamented with two small tubercles placed on the outer margin. Curvature elliptical. This hamite appears to be identified by its even, undulating ridges, each furnished with two tubercles, and the elliptical form of its curvature. It must, however, be acknowledged that there is considerable difficulty in distinguishing the essential characters of a fossil from the variations that are produced by age or accident, particularly when only a single specimen is known. Locality: Middleham. 41. Hamites attenuatus. Tablet 23, figures 8, 13. This species has already been described as occurring in the blue marl. Vide blue marl fossils, number 21. The specimens here figured are nearly cylindrical and covered with oblique annular striae. It is, however, doubtful whether they belong to the species referred to. Tablet 23, figure 5, is the fragment of a very large hamite, nearly allied to the preceding. It was collected at Hamsey by Mrs. Mantell. Localities: Hamsey, Middleham, Stoneham. 42. Hamites baculoides. Tablet 23, figures 6, 7. Cylindrical, elongated, marked with obscure, oblique, distant undulations on the outer margin. Curvature septa distant. Fragments from 1 to 6 inches in length and about 0.4 inches in diameter, marked with oblique undulations and occasionally exhibiting foliacea septa, are very abundant in every locality of the Grey Marl near Lewis. Those figured are the most perfect that have yet been discovered. This species may be easily recognized by its extraordinary length, by the smoothness of its surface, and the great obliquity of the few undulations with which it is ornamented. The form of the curvature is unknown, for although several hundred specimens have been examined, the short fragment delineated in figure 6, tablet 23, is the only known instance of a deviation from a straight line. These remains are associated with fragments of a large size, almost cylindrical, and perfectly smooth. Are these portions of the larger limbs of the same species? By an inadvertence, the specimens are represented in the plate, with the largest extremity downwards. Localities: in every marl pit in the southeastern part of Sussex. 42. Turrilitis costatus. Tablet 23, figure 15. Tablet 24, figures 1, 4, 5. Volutions reversed, convex, ornamented with transverse ribs, beneath which are 2 rows of tubercles. The upper half of each wreath is ornamented with about 20 smooth, rounded costae, beneath which is a row of elliptical tubercles, and a set of smaller ones on the inferior margin. The latter are partly obscured by the next whorl. In almost every example, the costae and tubercles pass into each other. The specimens that occur in Sussex very rarely exceed 3 or 4 volutions, and are always in some degree compressed. They are from 1 to 7 inches in circumference, and from 3 to 5 inches long. The lowermost volution is but rarely preserved, and no traces of the shell remain. Tablet 23, figure 15, represents a specimen with part of the lowermost volution. Tablet 24, figures 1, 4, 5, exhibit the usual varieties of this species. In figures 4 and 5, the union of the ribs with the tubercles is distinctly shown. Localities: Hamsey, Clayton. 43. Turrilitis undulatus. Tablet 24, Figure 8. Tablet 23, Figures 14, 16. Volutions reversed, ornamented with prominent transverse costae. This species was first noticed and described by the author. It is characterized by its prominent transverse costae, which are undulated in some examples and extend directly across the whorls in others. In many specimens the ribs are oblique and somewhat tubercular, a circumstance that has led some naturalists to question the correctness of considering the present species as distinct from T. costatus. In the casts of the adult shell, the characters of the two species are, however, distinctly marked, and leave no doubt of the propriety of their separation. The Turrilitis undulatus attains a larger size than the preceding, sometimes exceeding 3 inches in diameter. Tablet 24, Figure 8, represents a very perfect example. It consists of 8 volutions, including the lowermost, and exhibits the rounded base of the columella. On the opposite side, the Sphinculus, filled with sulphuret of iron, is beautifully shown. To my brother, Mr. Joshua Mantell, whose kindness I have had repeated occasions to acknowledge, I am indebted for the possession of this interesting specimen. Locality: Hamsey. 44. Turrilitis tuberculatus. Tablet 24, Figures 2, 3, 6, 7. Volutions reversed, beset with a longitudinal row of nodular projections, beneath which are 3 rows of tubercles. Inferior surface of the reeds radiated. This species is the largest of the genus. De Montfort mentions a specimen found at Rouen, which measured nearly 1.5 feet in length, and one found by the author at Middleham is of much larger dimensions. A row of from 15 to 16 obtuse rounded tubercles are disposed round each volution, at about 1/3 from the superior margin, and beneath these are placed 3 sets of smaller tubercles. The inferior surface of the whorls is marked with radiating costae that terminate in the lowermost row of tubercles. The Sphinculus is placed midway between the larger projections and the upper edge of the reeds, which is impressed by the ribs of the preceding volution. The base of the aperture is contracted, and the tubercles on the body of the last whorl are elongated, forming irregular tubercular costae, which are reflected towards the aperture. The fossil discovered by De Montfort appears to have been in such a state of perfection as to allow of its form being made out completely. It is regularly formed into a spire, the whorls of which are projecting and articulated, the foliaceous sutures produced by the edge of the septa being apparent. The opening of the shell is nearly round, the columella flat without any folds, and the septa perforated nearly in the center by a siphon. The magnificent British specimen of this species, previously alluded to, was found in a bank of Marl, near the mansion of the Reverend J. Constable at Middleham, in the parish of Ringmer. It is a cast of indurated marl of an ochraceous color, retaining in one part a thin iridescent pellicle of the pearly coat of the shell. 6 volutions remain, the largest of which is 5.5 inches in diameter. Upon a moderate calculation, the original, when perfect, must have exceeded 2 feet in length. The Sphinculus is exhibited on the 3 upper volutions. Tablet 24, Figure 7. A remarkably fine cast from middle. The Sphinculus shown in the three upper volutions does not exist in the specimen, but is introduced here that the subject may be more fully illustrated. Tablet 24, Figure 6. Perspective view of a cast placed in an inverted position to show the radiated costae on the base of the volutions. Localities Middleham, Stoneham. It is worthy of remark that this is the only species found in these localities, while at Hamsey and Offham, where the T. costatus and T. undulatus are met with, the present species does not occur. Bivalves. The bivalves of the grey chalk marl so rarely exhibit any traces of the hinge that their generic characters are but seldom distinguishable. The following are determined with as much accuracy as the imperfect state of the specimens would admit. 45. Arca. Casts of a small species, about 1.2 inch wide and 0.7 inch long, have been discovered at Middleham. The surface is marked with fine, concentric transverse striae. 46. Venericardia. Mineral Conchology, Tablet 259. This is a small species with diverging longitudinal striae, and is figured by Mr. Sowerby. Localities Middleham, Stoneham. 47. Astarte. A minute species covered with transverse striae. Locality Middleham. 48. Avicula. A thin, delicate species allied to Avicula media. Mineral Conchology, Tablet 2. Locality Hamsey. 49. Venus. Ringmariensis, Tablet 25, Figure 5. Suborbicular, with numerous transverse concentric striae, beaks incurved, approximate, margin entire. The fine cast here represented contains no vestige of the shell, and the structure of the hinge is in consequence unknown. As a temporary distinction, I have referred it to the genus Venus. Locality Middleham. Unique. 50. Cardium. Decusatum, Tablet 25, Figure 3. Valves longitudinally costated, costae radiating, decussated by concentric transverse striae, and sulci. Posterior side truncated, cordiform, anterior side produced, beaks incurved. This species in its general form approaches Cardium hibernicum, Mineral Conchology, Tablet 82, Figures 1, 2, but is distinguished by its numerous transverse sulci, the absence of the central protrusion, and by the posterior side being crossed by diverging striae. The length of this cast rather exceeds its width. The margin of the posterior side is raised, and a gentle depression is in consequence formed round the center, which is somewhat elevated. The termination of the anterior side is unknown. The dotted outline in the figure indicates its probable form. The beaks are small and incurved. The longitudinal ribs pass in a radiating manner from the beaks to the margin, but are not visible on the posterior side. The sulci by which they are decussated arise from the depression beneath the beaks, from whence they diverge across the posterior area, and, becoming concentric, terminate on the edge of the anterior slope. The margin of the valves is entire. Tablet 25, Figure 3, a cast from near Brighton. The shell itself is unknown. Localities: Brighton, Hamsey, Middleham, Offham. 51. Pecten Biaveri. Tablet 25, Figure 11. Depressed, suborbicular, with diverging longitudinal costae. Ears nearly equal to the width of the shell. Margin irregularly undulated. The costae are about 20 in number and diverge from the center of the hinge to the margin. The ears are almost equal to the transverse diameter of the shell. This species is from 2.5 inches to 3 inches in length and is commonly in a good state of preservation. In almost every example, the internal surface only is exposed, the shell being attached to the marl by the outer side. In a small portion, which I separated, the external surface was rugous, a circumstance that explains the cause of its adherence to the surrounding matrix. The specimen figured is from Hamsey. It shows the inner surface. Localities: Sutherham, Beachy Head, Hamsey, Ringmer. 52. Pecten triplicata. Tablet 25, Figure 9. Subtriangular, longitudinally striated, with 3 deep longitudinal furrows, which form angular placeae on the front, margin crenulated. Although but one valve of this elegant little pecten has been discovered, its characters are sufficiently remarkable to warrant a specific appellation. The surface is furrowed by 3 deep sulci that diverge from the hinge towards the margin, where they terminate in acute angular placeae. The shell is covered with minute longitudinal striae, decussated by transverse lines of growth. The margin is thick and delicately crenated. Locality: Hamsey. The shell itself remains and appears to have undergone but little change. 53. Pecten quinquecostata. Tablet 25, Figure 10. In many particulars, this beautiful shell resembles the flat valve of P. quinquecostata, but it is much more elongated and may probably belong to a distinct species. Locality: Hamsey. 54. Pecten laminosa. Tablet 26, Figure 8. 22. Suborbicular, much depressed, concentrically laminated, ears nearly equal. This shell so closely resembles P. orbicularis of Sowerby, Mineral Conchology, Tablet 186, that at first I was induced to consider it as belonging to that species. A more careful examination has, however, detected differences which appear to be specific. The striae in P. orbicularis are described as elevated and sharp, but in the shell before us they are very slight, and are produced by the termination of concentric laminae. The shell is very thin and possesses a glossy appearance. The width and length are nearly equal. Tablet 26, Figure 8, a fine specimen, with the shell entire. Tablet 26, Figure 22, is probably the undervalve of this species. Localities: Hamsey, Stoneham. 55. Pecten. Tablet 26, Figure 7. Although the valve here figured is perfect, yet as it only exhibits the inner surface and resembles in form several other shells of the genus, the species cannot at present be ascertained. Locality: Hamsey. 56. Plagiostoma aspera. Tablet 26, figure 18. Subdepressed, obovate, with numerous longitudinal aculeated sulci. To the naked eye, this shell appears as if marked with smooth longitudinal striae, but conveys a sensation of roughness to the touch. With the assistance of a lens, the striae are perceived to be sulci, dividing the surface into flat ribs, the edges of which are fringed with minute, sharp points. It has a few irregular lines of growth. The structure of the hinge is not shown in any of the specimens in my possession. This shell bears considerable resemblance to Lima spathula of Lamarck. Localities: Hamsey, Stoneham. Rare. 57. Plagiostoma. Tablet 19, figure 1. The cast of a transversely ovate depressed bivalve, apparently of this genus. It has 15 prominent costae, which diverge from the beaks to the margin. The latter is undulated. Localities: Hamsey, Middleham. 58. Plicactula spinosa. Tablet 26, figures 13, 16, 17. Ovate, depressed, spinous, spines adpressed, smallest on the deeper valve, margin entire. The specific description is that given by Mr. Sowerby, the Sussex specimens being imperfect and differing in some particulars from those figured in the mineral conchology. The latter are described as being obliquely ovate with an angle at the beaks, the deeper valve having radiating undulations with numerous minute aculeae. These are sometimes wanting. The other valve is for the most part externally concave, without undulations, but bearing sharp, hollow spines with their points pressed close to the surface, and often hooked. The surface that received the semi-external cartilage is sometimes very distinct, extending transversely upon the beaks, so as almost to form ears. Tablet 26, figures 13, 17, agree in many respects with the above description. The shell is very thin, and the spines closely pressed to the surface. Tablet 26, figure 16, is more convex than the preceding, has but few spines, and possesses a lamellated structure. Some specimens of this kind are nearly orbicular, almost destitute of spines, and frequently exceed 1.5 inch in width and length. These probably belong to another species. Localities: Hamsey, Stoneham. Mutilated specimens are very common. (59) Terebratula subrotunda, mineral conchology, tablet 15, figures 1 and 2. Subrotund, somewhat depressed, smooth, valves equally convex, beaks short. This and the following species are abundant in the chalk, but of rare occurrence in the marl. They are so common that a particular description is unnecessary. Localities: Hamsey, Eastbourne. 60. Terebratula subundata, mineral conchology, tablet 15, figure 7. Subovate, somewhat depressed, smooth, valves equally gibbous, margin depressed in front, with 2 lateral undulations. Localities: Hamsey, Eastbourne. 61. Terebratula sulcata, depressed, transversely ovate, with diverging longitudinal furrows. Upper valve convex, lower valve depressed anteriorly. front of the depressions straight, plicated, with an undulation on each side, beak small, margin serrated. The shell is about 0.5 inch long and 0.6 wide. The sulci are strongly marked, about 15 or 16 on each valve, 3 or 4 occupying the straight front of the margin. The beak is slightly produced and has a circular perforation. This species is common at Hamsey. The sulci are bolder and fewer in number on the straight part of the margin than in the other terebraculae of the chalk. Localities: Hamsey, Stoneham. (62) Terebracula martini. Subscrutiform, longitudinally striated, margin finely serrated, both valves slightly depressed in front, beaks very small. This is a very minute and delicate species, scarcely 0.3 inch either in length or width. Each valve is marked with upwards of 30 longitudinal striae, and both are equally convex. The margin is finely serrated by the terminations of the striae, and is nearly straight in front. The sides are not waved, as in the last species. The specific name is in commemoration of the late William Martin, Esquire, FLS, of Macclesfield, the scientific author of Petrificata derbiaceae, etc., whose premature death must be deeply lamented by every friend of science. Locality: Hamsey. (63) Terebracula stritula. Tablet 25, figures 7, 8, 12. Subscrutiform, contracted at the beaks, longitudinally striated, striae fine, diverging, margin acute, undulated in front, depressed on each side of the beak, lower valve with a broad longitudinal sulcus. The length of this species is generally 0.9 inch, the greatest width 0.7 inch, thickness 0.4 inch. The upper valve is convex in the middle and gradually slopes towards the margin. The lower valve has a sulcus along the middle. The beak is slightly produced, and beneath it the margin is inflected on both sides. The striae are fine, diverging from the beak to the margin. The latter is acute and has a gentle undulation in front, produced by the dorsal groove. In the young shell this appearance is not observable. The specimens are marked with transverse lines of increase. The form of this shell resembles that of Conchiliolithus and Anomites saculus of Martin, but that species is more convex and is destitute of striae. Tablet 25, figures 7, 8, 12, exhibit a dorsal, front, and lateral view of the same specimen. Locality: Hamsey. Very rare. 64. Terebracula squamosa. Longitudinally ovate, valves equally convex, surface squamous, margin of the lower valve incumbent, beaks produced. Length 0.5 inch, width 0.4 inch, the greatest convexity of the united valves 0.3 inch. Both valves are equally gibbous. The margin of the lowermost is slightly incumbent and surrounds the edge of the upper valve. The lines of increase are numerous, concentric, and squamous. The beak is a little produced and has a circular aperture. The shells of the terebraculae of the grey marl are always in a good state of preservation. In the present species even some vestige of the color remains, the specimens being invariably of a bluish hue. Locality: Hamsey. (65) Inocerramus tenuis. Valves convex, marked with numerous fine concentric lines. Posterior side depressed, small, lunulate. Hinge side short, expanded. Beaks convex, incurved. Hinge oblique. The shell of this species is remarkably thin and fragile, and is marked with numerous concentric lines produced by the lamellated structure of the surface. The valves are regularly convex and deepest in the middle. The posterior slope is small and lunulate, the anterior short and expanded. The hinge is rather oblique. A few indistinct transverse undulations are observable in some examples. The specimens are usually about 4 inches long and 3 inches wide. The depth of the united valves, 2.8 inches. Localities: Hamsey, Offham. 66. Inoceremus crispsea. Tablet 27, figure 11. Obovate, much depressed, with numerous concentric transverse ridges. Beaks acuminated. Posterior side small, depressed. Anterior side expanded. Hinge oblique. The valves are of an obovate form, much depressed, and marked with strong concentric ridges, somewhat obliquely disposed. These characters distinguish the present species from the one above described. The beaks are acuminated. The shell increases in width but diminishes in depth as it approaches the front. The posterior slope is small and depressed. The anterior expands to form the hinge furrow. Casts of this species are common, but the shell is seldom preserved. I have named it in honor of my esteemed friend John Martin Cripps, Esquire, M.A., and it is with great pleasure that I thus publicly express my grateful acknowledgments for his kind exertions in promoting the success of the present publication. Localities: Ringmer, Hamsey, Offham. Several other species of Inoceremus occur in the grey marl, but the specimens hitherto discovered are in too mutilated a state to admit of accurate determination. Fossil fishes. The grey marl has afforded a few examples of the remains of fishes, but these are exceedingly imperfect. Fragments of bones, a few small vertebrae, irregular patches of scales, and an inconsiderable number of teeth are the only specimens hitherto noticed. '67. Remains of a fish, tablet 34, figure 10. This fossil was discovered at Hamsey. It shows vestiges of the tail and of one fin, but no conjecture can be formed of the genus of the original. '68. Tooth of the Squalus mustellus. A tooth apparently of this species of shark is delineated in tablet 32, figure 5. It is very rare. Locality: Hamsey. 69. Tooth of the Squalus galeus. Tablet 32, figure 12. This specimen resembles the teeth of the recent species. Locality: Hamsey, Eastbourne. Of the remains of Crustacea, a few portions only have been found, sufficient indeed to prove the existence of this order of animals in the grey chalk marl, but too imperfect to allow of a detailed description. But certainly not of vegetable matter. Organic Remains, Volume 1, page 447. With the linear leaves surrounding it. Geological Transactions, Volume 3, page 250. Decussedly opposite. i.e. arranged crosswise in 4 rows. A Ocellatum of Ellis. Ellis's Zoophytes, 1 volume, quarto, 1786, tablet 1, figures 4 and 5. The angular margin is a remarkable character by which this species may be readily identified. In a specimen of Trochus agglutinans from Grignon, recently presented me by Monsieur Broguiat, the outer margin of the last whorl very closely resembles that of the present fossil. Var costata. The plates of this work were completed before any illustrative specimens of the other varieties had been discovered. Turrilites. Turrilites, a spiral, turreted, multilocular univalve. Volutions contiguous and apparent. Septa foliaceous, pierced near the upper margin by a siphunculus. Aperture round. Columella smooth. The septa perforated nearly in the center by a siphon. Organic Remains, Volume 3, page 147. The siphunculus is exhibited on the 3 upper volutions. This specimen is figured in Sowerby's Mineral Conchology, tablet 74. Oops. This beautiful shell resembles the flat valve of P. quinque costata, vid. Chalk Fossils, number 64. Margin entire. Mineral Conchology, Volume 3, page 79. Extending transversely upon the beaks so as almost to form ears. Mineral Conchology, Volume 3, page 80. This and the following species are abundant in the chalk, vid. Chalk Fossils, number 76. Conchiliolithis Anomites sacculus of Martin, Petrificata derbiensia, tablet 46, figures 1, 2.